In the middle of March 1918, a ship is expected at Baltimore. She is the largest vessel in the United States Navy, a coal carrier, a collier, 542 feet of gray steel, her decks a forest of cargo booms and king posts. Her name is the Cyclops. She has come up from Brazil with a heavy cargo in her holds, called at Barbados for stores, and turned north for home. The passage should take about 9 days. The date she is due comes. The pier stays empty. A day passes, then a week. Ships are late for 100 small reasons, a spell of weather, a fouled boiler, a change of orders, and so no one is alarmed at first. But the Cyclops carries no small crew. Aboard her are 306 people, her sailors and her officers, a consul general on his way home to Washington, and a handful of prisoners riding north under guard. And she carries a wireless set that has said nothing. The rule at sea in wartime required a ship to answer when she was called and to report her position by wireless. Aboard the Cyclops, the set stayed silent. The Navy begins to look. It sends ships back along her track from the West Indies up the American coast. Harbors are checked on the thought that she might have anchored somewhere to wait out trouble. Stations are asked for any signal logged in her name. The searchers find no distress call in the records. They find no wreckage on the water, no oil, no boats, and no note in any logbook of a ship that passed her and waved. They find nothing at all. In April, the Navy tells the country that the Cyclops is missing. In June, it makes the finding official, and 306 people are carried on the rolls as dead. The president himself, when he was told, is reported to have said that only God and the sea know where the great ship has gone. More than a century later, that is still where the case stands. No one knows where the Cyclops lies or how she came to lie there. She is the largest single loss of life in the history of the United States Navy that had nothing to do with an enemy. And the question she left behind has outlived everyone who asked it. How does a ship that size vanish on a well-traveled sea without a single word? This episode is the file on that question. The ship, the man who commanded her, the cargo she was never built for, and the two sister ships that 23 years later answered part of the riddle in the worst possible way. To understand her end, you have to understand what she was built to do and what she was quietly asked to do instead. The Cyclops was a collier. In the years before oil, warships ran on coal, and a battle fleet burned it by the thousands of tons. A dreadnought was helpless without it, and a fleet that wanted to operate far from home needed coal brought out to it across the ocean. A collier's whole reason for being was that slow, filthy, essential trade. Carry the coal, come alongside, and pass it across, sack by sack and grab by grab, until the warship's bunkers were full and everything aboard both ships was black with dust. The Navy had learned the value of that trade the embarrassing way. In 1907, it sent 16 battleships around the world, the Great White Fleet, the loudest advertisement of American power ever staged to that date. The battleships were American. The coal that moved them for long stretches of the cruise came out of chartered foreign colliers because the Navy did not own enough of its own. A fleet that borrows its fuel carriers borrows its reach. The lesson went into the shipbuilding budget almost at once, and the answer was a class of enormous, purpose-built colliers, the biggest auxiliaries the service had ever ordered. The Cyclops was built for exactly that work by William Cramp and Sons of Philadelphia, launched in 1910, one of 4 sisters of the Proteus-class. Big, plain haulers, they were among the largest ships the Navy owned. Her sisters were the Proteus, the Nereus, and the Jupiter. Hold on to those names. Two of them come back near the end of this file, and what happens to them changes how the whole case reads. Coaling a warship at sea or in a roadstead was an all-hands evolution, and it explains everything about how these ships were shaped. The collier came alongside, booms swung out, and for hours or days, every winch ran and every man worked, filling bags and buckets in the collier's holds, swaying them across, dumping them down the warship's chutes. Crews raced one another for tonnage records. When it ended, both ships were black to the mastheads, and the fleet could steam another 2 weeks. Unglamorous is the polite word for the work. Indispensable is the accurate one. Picture her lines. Along her spine ran a double row of tall steel king posts, the uprights that anchored her cargo booms, so that from a distance she looked like a floating gantry more than a ship of war. Between them, below decks, ran the long coal holds, deep bins meant to be filled from above through hatches and emptied by clamshell grab. Her bridge stood on raised supports well forward, almost on stilts, so that coal dust and cargo gear could pass beneath it. Sailors who saw her did not forget the profile. It looked like nothing else afloat, and that detail, an odd bridge on legs, will matter again 50 years after her loss. She was efficient at her one job and unlovely at everything else. Her early career was steady and unglamorous, coaling the fleet along the Atlantic coast and in the Caribbean, a survey voyage to the Baltic, support work off Mexico during the Veracruz crisis of 1914, where she also carried refugees. When the United States entered the war in 1917, she coaled escorts and crossed with a convoy to France, then came home to the ordinary drudgery of fleet supply. In January of 1918, she was assigned to the Naval Overseas Transportation Service and sent south to Brazilian waters to coal Allied ships operating in the South Atlantic. She had one more quiet trouble, and it mattered. On the passage north, her starboard engine, one of only two, was found to have a cracked high-pressure cylinder, and it was shut down. A board of survey examined the damage and judged the engine unfit for use. Standard practice held that a machinery casualty of that kind be made good before a long open ocean voyage. The survey was the mechanism meant to force that reckoning. Aboard the Cyclops, the finding was recorded, the repairs were deferred to home, and the ship carried on toward Baltimore on one engine at reduced speed with her margin of power cut in half. A ship favoring one engine is a ship with a narrower margin. Margins are what the sea takes first. And this ship was about to have her margins narrowed twice more, once by her cargo and once by the man on her bridge. The commanding officer of the Cyclops was Lieutenant Commander George Worley, and there has never been a stranger figure at the center of an American naval mystery. He was born Johann Friedrich Wichmann in a village near Bremen in Germany in 1862. As a young man, he went to sea in merchant sail, and in the 1880s he landed in San Francisco, where in time he took a new name, George Worley, and later American citizenship. He worked the Pacific trade for years, and when the Navy formed its auxiliary service and needed experienced merchant masters for its new colliers, Worley was exactly the kind of man it hired. He took command of the Cyclops when she was brand new in 1910, and he never commanded anything else. By 1918, ship and master had been together for 8 years. The men who served under him left a portrait that would be hard to invent. He was a big man with a temper, more merchant skipper than naval officer, and he ran his ship by habits all his own. Crewmen described him walking his rounds at night in his long underwear, with a derby hat on his head and a cane in his hand. Accounts collected later speak of drinking, of feuds with his wardroom, and of punishments handed out on a whim. This was more than color. In 1917, His own officers brought formal complaints against him, and the Navy convened an investigation into his conduct, including the charge that he was drunk on duty. The practice of the service required a commanding officer found unfit to be relieved. Aboard the Cyclops, the complaints were heard, the war was on, experienced masters were scarce, and Worley stayed on his bridge. Remember, too, where he was born. In the spring of 1918, the United States was at war with Germany, and here was a German-born captain sailing a Navy ship with a German-born consul general aboard as a passenger. None of that had stopped the Navy from trusting him with the largest ship it owned. But the moment the Cyclops went missing, those two birthplaces would become the seed of a rumor that chased this case for decades. Keep it in mind. The record will deal with it squarely when we reach the why. There is a detail about the rumor worth logging now. Most of the Navy did not know, while Worley lived, that he had ever carried another name. It was the Office of Naval Intelligence, digging through his past after the ship vanished, that traced George Worley of San Francisco back to Johann Wichmann of Bremen. The discovery arrived exactly when the country was least equipped to hear it calmly, and it turned an eccentric dead captain into a suspect. Suspicion manufactured after the fact is still suspicion of a kind, and the record will weigh it in its turn. The rest of the ship's company were ordinary men of the wartime Navy. Most of the roughly 230 crew were young enlisted sailors, firemen and coal passers and seamen, with a wardroom of junior officers over them. The passengers numbered around 70, and they boarded at Rio for every kind of reason the war could supply. The best known was Alfred Louis Moreau Gottschalk, the American consul general at Rio de Janeiro, a prominent figure in the American colony there, giving up his post to go home and volunteer for the army. There were sailors traveling on orders and men returning to the United States for reassignment, and there was a small group riding north under guard, men convicted by courts-martial on the fleet flagship in Brazilian waters, one of them under sentence for the killing of a shipmate. A Navy ship is a small town, and this one sailed with the whole range of a town aboard, the honored, the ordinary, and the condemned. 306 people, every one of them with a reason to be aboard and a life waiting on the far side of the crossing. The ship that carried them was about to take on a cargo she was never designed to hold. Her last voyage began at Rio de Janeiro in February of 1918. The errand itself tells you something about the state of the war. Manganese is a mineral used to harden steel, and steel for shells and ships was being made as fast as American mills could pour it. Brazil had the ore. What the Allies lacked was hulls to move it. So the Navy's big colliers, coming home from the South Atlantic anyway, were pressed into the ore trade, and the Cyclops was ordered to load manganese at Rio for the run to Baltimore. Understand what that meant physically. Coal is bulky and comparatively light. A hold filled to the top with coal is a hold filled with a great deal of air. Manganese ore is the opposite, dense, close-packed, enormously heavy for the space it fills. A hold designed to be full of coal will be only part full of ore when the ship reaches her load limit, which concentrates the weight low in the hull, in a few deep piles, instead of spreading it through the ship. Load a coal carrier with ore, and you have changed the way every wave works on her bones. The practice for carrying dense mineral cargo was already old knowledge in the merchant trade. The rule required such a cargo to be trimmed level and secured so the weight could not shift, and it required the ship not be laden past the depth her load line allowed. Aboard the Cyclops, roughly 10,800 tons of ore went into holds built for coal, loaded under wartime pressure by a crew that hauled coal for a living. How carefully that ore was trimmed, no surviving record can say. She sailed from Rio in the middle of February, called briefly at Bahia on the Brazilian coast, and stood out into the Atlantic for home, riding deep on one engine. Then came a stop no one had planned. Instead of running straight for Baltimore, the Cyclops put in at Barbados, at Bridgetown, at the beginning of March. Worley's stated reason was practical. Deep-laden and slow, the ship would need more coal and provisions than expected for the passage north. The American consul at Bridgetown, Brockholst Livingston, dealt with the unscheduled visitor, and what he saw stayed with him. The ship lay low in the water, by some accounts with the sea over her load line. After she vanished, Livingston would cable Washington his concerns about how deep she had been and how strange the visit had seemed. Whether she was truly overloaded or simply loaded to the limit and looking every ton of it is one of the honest, open questions of this file. What is not in question is the arithmetic she sailed with. A dense cargo in the wrong kind of hold, a hull riding at or past her marks, one engine out of two, and 8 or 9 days of open Atlantic ahead. On the 4th of March, 1918, the Cyclops steamed out of Bridgetown Harbor, bound for Baltimore. A routine signal attributed to her from this passage reads, in its entirety, "Weather fair, all well." After that, the record is empty. Here is the difficulty at the center of this case, and it is worth stating plainly because it is the whole shape of the mystery. There is no event to narrate. For almost every ship lost at sea, there is a moment to point to. A distress call at a known hour, a survivor's account, a piece of wreckage that tells its own short story. A timeline can be built, and an episode like this one usually lives inside that timeline, minute by minute. Here, there is none of that. The Cyclops passed out of all human knowledge somewhere in the deep water between the West Indies and the American coast, and the file holds nothing between her departure and her absence. One thread exists, and it is thin. Days after she sailed, a merchant ship called the Amolco reported having passed a large collier off the Virginia Capes on the 9th of March, and a hard gale swept that coast the following day. If the ship was the Cyclops, she had nearly finished her passage before whatever happened, and the storm becomes a suspect. But the Navy could never confirm the sighting, and there were reasons to doubt a one-engine ship could have been that far north that soon. The report sits in the file marked exactly what it is, unconfirmed. So the timeline is only this. On the 4th of March, she sails. By the middle of the month, she is overdue at Baltimore. Through late March and April, warships and patrol craft retrace her route, check the anchorages of the Caribbean, and query every station and every passing ship. On the 14th of April, the Navy announces publicly that she is missing. On the 1st of June, she and every soul aboard are declared lost. The search finds no boat, no raft, no ring buoy, no oil comes ashore, no cargo boom or hatch cover drifts into the shipping lanes with her name on it. In an ocean crossed daily by convoys and patrols at the height of a world war, when every navy on the water is watching for everything, the largest ship in the United States Navy leaves no trace whatsoever. The country noticed. Into the vacuum of fact poured everything else. Through that spring, the newspapers tried the case daily with material they did not have. A German plot one week, a mutiny of the prisoners the next, a monstrous wave, even a giant sea creature in the less careful columns. The Navy Department, which had nothing to add, kept saying so, and the saying of it only fed the mystery. It is worth understanding that the legend of the Cyclops was born here, in April of 1918, in headlines written before the search was even finished. The file underneath the headlines stayed thin, and it stayed honest. Whatever happened to her happened quickly. That is nearly the only firm conclusion the silence allows, and the wireless is the reason it holds. A Navy ship in wartime kept a listening watch around the clock, The practice required an operator at or near the key at all hours, and a distress call takes seconds to begin. The set has its own aerials, its own battery supply, its own trained men whose whole duty is that key. For no call to have gone out at all, the ship must have been past sending it almost as soon as anyone knew she was in trouble. A ship with time on her side sends a wireless call, or swings out boats that are later found, or is simply seen. The Cyclops did none of these. Whatever took her fast enough that no one among 306 people could reach the key and tap out a single word. The question then is, what can take a 542-foot ship that fast? The Court of Inquiry faced that question with an empty table, and so must we. With no wreck, no bodies, and no witness, the Naval Court of Inquiry could not say what happened. It could only weigh what might have. A century of study since has done the same. The possibilities come down to a short, honest list, and one loud rumor, which the record disposes of first. Because Captain Worley was German-born, and because the Consul General Gottschalk had also been born in Germany, and because this was wartime, the whisper went round that the Cyclops had been betrayed, that her captain had handed her to the enemy, or steered her to a German port, or met a U-boat by arrangement. The story ran in newspapers and refused to die for years. It is worth being clear about what the record shows. The Office of Naval Intelligence investigated Worley's background and conduct and found suspicion, eccentricity, and no evidence of treason. And when the war ended, investigators could do what wartime rumor never can. They read the other side's files. German records showed no submarine and no raider operating on the Cyclops' track in March of 1918. No capture, no sinking, no ship brought in. Germany had no more idea where the Cyclops was than Washington did. The rumor stays in the file only as a rumor, closed. A second theory from the period can be closed almost as quickly. The Cyclops carried prisoners, her captain was hated by some of his officers, and so the press asked whether the ship had been taken from within. A mutiny is at least a real thing, unlike a sea monster, but a mutiny does not sink a ship, it seizes one. A ship taken by mutineers still exists. She makes for a port, or is found adrift, or is seen. Nothing of the kind was ever reported in any port on either side of the Atlantic. Whatever a mutiny might explain about the silence of her wireless, it explains nothing about the disappearance of her hull, and the record sets it aside. What is left are the causes a ship of her kind actually fears, and each one has to be measured against the same hard test. It must be able to kill a very large ship before her wireless can be used. Begin with the load itself and with the rule that governed it. The load line, the mark on a ship's side that the sea must never stand above, had been law in the merchant world for decades, and the practice required a laden ship to leave port with that mark clear of the water and her cargo trimmed so it would stay that way. Aboard the Cyclops at Bridgetown, by the Consul Livingston's account, the sea stood at or over her marks, and no one stopped her sailing. Overloading on its own rarely sinks a ship in fair weather. What it does is spend the margins in advance, the reserve of buoyancy, and the freeboard that a hull draws on when something else goes wrong. She left Barbados with those margins already spent. Now the cargo. She carried dense manganese ore in holds drawn for coal, stowed in deep concentrated piles. The particular danger of a cargo like that is shift. If a heavy mineral cargo is not trimmed and secured, a roll in a beam sea can set it sliding, and once 10,000 tons start to move, the ship heels, the cargo slides further, and she passes the angle from which she can right herself. A ship taken that way goes over in minutes or less. Her wireless aerials go into the sea with everything else. Of all the candidates, this one requires the fewest assumptions. The cargo she carried, in the holds she had, with the trimming no record can vouch for. Then there is structure. That same concentrated weight worked her hull in ways her designers never drew. A laden hull flexes in a seaway, and the Cyclops' frames and girders were carrying point loads far beyond anything Cole had ever put on them. If the hull failed, if her back broke between two heavy holds, she could open to the sea and go down by sections, fast, deep water under her and no time for signals. Later, students of the case have added a slower cousin to this theory. Manganese ore is mildly corrosive in contact with steel and water, and a winter of ore cargoes may have been quietly eating at her from the inside. The inquiry could test none of this without a wreck. It still cannot be tested for the same reason, and there is the sea itself, the oldest suspect of all. The Atlantic in March breeds sudden hard weather, and the unconfirmed gale off Virginia sits in the file like an unsigned confession, a deep-laden ship, down to her marks or past them, on one engine, cannot run from weather and cannot climb the seas the way a ship in trim can. Water on deck, a hatch stove in over an oar hold, a list that the dense cargo turns into a capsize. No single link in that chain is exotic. All of it has killed ships before and since. One thing that might have saved the story, if nothing else, was absent. In the U-boat war, the safest passage was in convoy, ships in company, each a witness for the others. The practice for valuable ships was to sail them escorted where escorts could be had. The Cyclops made her last passage alone, unescorted, with no consort near enough to see what became of her or mark the place where it happened. Whichever of the three dangers found her, the sea was empty of witnesses when it did. The court of inquiry, weighing all of this, refused to guess. Many theories had been advanced, the Navy recorded, and none satisfactorily accounted for her disappearance. It is an unusual sentence for an official file, an institution admitting in writing that it does not know. And there, for 23 years, the matter rested. Then the sea did something close to unheard of. It repeated the experiment. Remember the sisters, the Proteus, the Nereus, and the Jupiter, built to the same plans, in the same yard, for the same trade. The Jupiter we can set aside first, because her fate is the strange bright thread in this class. In 1920, she was rebuilt with a flat deck over her holds and renamed the Langley, the first aircraft carrier the United States ever had. She served for 2 more decades and was lost in 1942 under Japanese bombs in a battle her crew could name. Hers was a different story with a different ending, and it proves the hulls could serve long and hard. The Proteus and the Nereus stayed what they were built to be, big ore and coal haulers, and by 1941 both were working the Caribbean run, carrying bauxite, the dense aluminium ore, from the islands toward Canadian and American ports. Another war was closing in, and the same wartime pressure had put the same class of ship on the same kind of errand. In late November 1941, the Proteus sailed from St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands, laden with ore, and was never seen again. About 2 weeks later, the Nereus sailed from the same harbor, with the same kind of cargo, on the same route. She vanished too. No distress call from either, no wreckage, no survivors. When German naval records were examined after that war, no U-boat had claimed either ship, and the dates fall before Germany's submarines opened their campaign in those waters. Line the 3 cases up, because this is the quiet clincher of the whole file. 3 sisters of one class, 3 heavy ore cargoes in holds designed for coal, 3 disappearances without a signal, a boat or a plank. Once is a mystery. 3 times, in the same hulls, under the same load, is a pattern. It points hard at the thing the 1918 inquiry could only circle, that something in the meeting of this class of ship and this kind of cargo, the concentrated weight, the strained frames, the narrow margins, could take one whole and quickly without leaving time for a word. The lesson, learned 3 ships too late, was a lesson about load. Dense mineral cargoes are now governed by their own body of rules, how they must be trimmed, how their moisture and their shifting are to be controlled, how deep a ship carrying them may lawfully lie. The modern codes that govern bulk carriers were built case by case on exactly this kind of knowledge, and ore cargoes are treated today as among the most dangerous things a dry ship can carry. The Cyclops went to sea lawfully loaded by the standards of her day. The standards of her day were wrong, and the pattern she began did not end with her sisters. Bulk ships full of ore kept vanishing quickly, sometimes without a call, deep into the modern era. In 1980, the British ore carrier Derbyshire, a ship 960 feet long, went down in a typhoon off Japan with all 44 aboard, and no distress signal was ever received. It took nearly 2 decades and an undersea survey before her hatches told the story of how fast the sea got in. Every investigation of that kind has tightened the rules another turn, and every one of them stands on files like this one. Heavy cargo, fast loss, no word. One more entry sits at the bottom of the file, and it is worth including because it may one day reopen the case. In 1968, a Navy master diver named Dean Hawes, working a search off the Virginia Capes, came down on a large steel wreck in about 180 feet of water. What he remembered ever afterward was the bridge, standing on raised steel supports like a building on stilts. Only later, seeing a photograph of the Cyclops, did he realize what that profile matched. The Navy looked for the wreck again in 1974 and could not relocate it. The sighting has never been confirmed, and the sea off the Capes keeps many wrecks. But if the Amolco really did pass her on the 9th of March, and the gale of the 10th really did find her there, then Hawes's wreck on stilts is exactly where the Cyclops ought to be. As for the other story that attached itself to her, it can be dealt with in a sentence. Decades after the loss, writers assembling the legend of the Bermuda Triangle adopted the Cyclops as a founding exhibit, a giant ship swallowed by a haunted sea. Her route did cross those waters. Nothing else about her case needs anything haunted at all. An overloaded ship, a dense shifting cargo, a crippled engine, a March gale, and 2 sisters lost the same way. The file explains itself without the folklore, and the folklore has explained nothing. There is no wreck to visit, unless Hawes's silent shape off the Capes is one day found again and named. There is nowhere to lay a wreath except the ocean itself. Somewhere in the Atlantic, the Cyclops lies with her oar and her 306, and the sea has kept its silence for more than 100 years. The Navy still carries the names, everyone, the young firemen and coal passers who worked her holds, the junior officers of her wardroom, the prisoners riding home under guard, whose sentences the sea commuted to the same fate as everyone else's, Consul General Gottschalk going home to serve, and Captain George Worley, born Johann Wichmann, the strange, difficult master in the derby hat who had commanded her for every year of her life and went down with her, cleared by the record of everything except being hard to like. The Cyclops was expected at Baltimore in the middle of March 1918. The pier stayed empty. Her file was never closed, because there was never anything to close it with. No position, no cause, no wreck, no word. She is one of a small company of ships that simply stepped out of the world. 9 years before her, the liner Waratah left Durban for Cape Town with 211 aboard and vanished the same way. No wreck ever found. That investigation is the companion to this one.